my name is Cadence, and my partners in this research project are Lincoln and Ava. And the topic that we chose was game theory in the education setting, specifically when looking at school choice. Now, our research question was, how do families, schools, and policymakers all interact strategically in a school choice system? And what are the equilibrium outcomes under different funding and admission policies? For those of you who don't know, school choice is a very varied category. There are a lot of different forms of school choice program, and these are each going to differ on a state-by-state basis because it is up to the states to determine what kind of policies they want to implement. Some of the more common school choice programs and policies are school vouchers, which are essentially kind of subsidies that follow the student regardless of what school they're attending, as opposed to just keeping the funding strictly in a public setting. There's also educational savings accounts, or ESAs, which are savings accounts that allow parents to deposit money into them and then withdraw that money that is going to be kind of more tax exempt, which allows them to use that money for specifically designated educational purposes. You also have charter schools, which are kind of a hybrid between public and private schools. So they are technically considered public schools, but the way that they operate, it's in the way that the teachers handle interacting with curriculum aligns a little more closely with private schools for students who are going to more thrive in that kind of environment. You also have open enrollment, which essentially says regardless of what district or county you live in, you can enroll in any school that is under that open enrollment policy. And then finally, you have education tax credit programs, which are essentially tax credit programs that will return money back to parents who have opted to either enroll their students in private schools or homeschool their students. This just helps making those kind of options more affordable. So why is this important, you may ask? Well, first, I don't think that anyone is going to challenge the idea that education is very important, that the education that a student receives will set them up for either failure or success. If you look at the status of the United States education, we're not doing too hot. A lot of our students are performing significantly below level. We have abnormally high levels of novice performers, which for those of you who are not familiar with our current ranking of kind of proficiency levels, we have 4 different levels. You've got novice, apprentice, proficient, and distinguished. Proficient means that they're performing at level. A vast majority of our students, particularly students that I have worked with in field work that I've done in schools, have been performing at that novice level with a couple at the apprentice. So we're underperforming in a lot of categories. So this tells us that it's time for something to change. If you look at Kentucky enrollment in public schools, that number is, or that percentage is declining over the years as more families opt for homeschooling or private schooling because they're discontent with the way that the public schools are currently operating. So this tells us that there is a need for change. Now, what does this have to do with school choice? Well, if you look at school choice programs nationwide, only 17 states don't have any form of school choice policy. For those of you who don't want to do the math, that means that there are 33 states that do have these school choice policies in place. And what we're going to be doing is looking and examining if having extra options, having alternatives to just the standard public school way of doing schooling, if that is going to be beneficial for students. Now, obviously, we can't look at exact data of, student performance because we're not running that kind of a experiment, but we can look at kind of the anticipated utility and the anticipated payoffs of different choices for both governments, for policymakers, for the schools themselves, and then for parents and the students who attend those schools.
So, for our game theoretic approach, like I discussed last week, we have a sequential move game with 3 players involved, the government, the schools, and the parents. So the government moves first, allocating resources fairly to each school, and the schools respond second, and then the parents go last based off how the schools react. and how the government reacts. And then we're going to use backwards induction to find the equilibria. And then our goal is to demonstrate how there can be stable but unequal outcomes. So, like I said, just to recap, first move is the government. So they're going to fund resources across all counties. They're going to consider equity, performance, and political pressure. And to simplify the game, we're going to categorize the schools from high level, mid level, and under resourced or low income schools. And then the payoffs for the government are going to be graduation rates, public perception, and how well they implement their system efficiently. And then second is the school response. So they're going to look at the funding that they get from the school, from the government. They can alter their admissions process, target specific demographics, market their programs, and I will go over an example in the game model of a program that the parents will choose from. And then they're going to consider how they can improve their outcomes, secure more funding from the government, and maximize their enrollment. And then the payoffs here are how well they're perceived, their reputation by the parents, the student performance, how well the students test, and then the long-term resource stability that they get from the government. And then last is the parents again. So they're just going to look at what the schools do for their strategies, what the schools do for their programs. Do they choose to do testing? Are they just strictly money per year? Are they free? What's the example? And then they're going to consider how well the school is, the location, the admissions process, and the future opportunity the child gets. And here again, like I said last week, the level of income is a very important variable that determines the equilibrium that we see in the game model and can determine long-term inequality, even though they're acting rationally as a family. And so the payoffs here are if the child performs well. And then again, we're going to look at the backwards induction to see how this decision by the parents affect the overall system in the first round and then also in infinite rounds. So here is the game model that I introduced this week for the presentation. And so for the example, I'm going to give that the parents have a child that is very exceptional in the arts program. So they're very good at, let's say, music, whatever instrument they play. So the parent knows this. So they have three options of schools that they have: high level, mid level, and low level or under resource schools. The government allocates fair resources in the first round to each level. Now, the high level school knows that they have the best programs in the county or the state or wherever. They're offering 10,000 per year to go to the school. So that's the barrier to entry there for the parent. That's what the parent has to consider in order if they want to get, as we see, the best payoff of five. Second is the mid-level school. And that school still has a barrier to entry. It's test scores. We see that all over the county and in the state and everywhere. Schools don't necessarily require 10,000 per year, but they need to know that the child is smart enough to get into the school so that way they can benefit from them. And again, they don't have the best programs, but they have average programs or better than average programs that the child can still get good opportunities from. And then the low level school is free and has below average programs, but every now and then we see free schools that pull in exceptional talents. And even though they're not compared greatly to the mid-level, high-level schools, they still are there to give parents an opportunity for their child to get education, which is very important and something that, is necessary. So here we see that the schools, their demographics, what they choose to do, their admissions process is responding to the government funding. So they know that every school is getting the same amount of funding. So what does each school do that can separate themselves to be able to get parents to go to their school, right? So high level school, like I said, that's their choice, 10,000 per year. Mid level school, they want to look at test scores, that's their choice. Low level school, they don't really have uh, a choice, so they're going to be free, and they're still going to be offering programs. So this is where the important variable comes in of how much money the parent makes. If the parent has a high level income parent, then they have the better opportunity to choose between a different variation of schools. So if they make enough money, let's say 10,000 per year for the child to go there, then they're going to choose to go there because the payoff will be a five, right? That's the best payoff for them. That's what they're going to choose. If let's say they don't have that, but they know that their child is smart enough to get into this mid-level school and get an average program that where the child can still benefit and the parent can get a three, they're gonna do that as an alternative. And then if it's a low income family, they don't have those opportunities as we see in real life all the time, but they still want to give their child an education. They still want to get them into the program so that way they can use their talent. They're going to go to the low level school that's free, even though the program's not as good, but it's still, a program that's better than nothing. And the parents' payoff is a two here. And so at the very bottom, parents' payoffs are on the right, the school payoff is in the middle, and the government payoff is on the left. So parents' payoff on the left, bottom left, is a five. The school payoff is a four because they know that they're bringing in a talented kid, they're helping their enrollment, and they're showing the government that, hey, we're bringing in these kids, we deserve more funding, our school's the best in the state, right? Happens all the time. The government gets a four because that school is performing well, they implemented their system well, the graduation rates are good, and their public reception is good. The mid-level school, everybody's content. They all get threes. It's not bad. It's not great, but it's still good. So parent gets a three. They know their child's going to get a good opportunity. The school is still bringing in smart kids. They're still bringing in exceptional kids that are good for their program, and they're helping with their enrollment process. The government is still implementing a decent system that's efficient. It's not as good as the high level, but it's still content. The low level school here is it's the lowest payoffs of all, but it's still available option. The payoff for the parent is a two. It's not the best. The payoff for the school is a three because even though it's a low level school, every now and then we see low level schools that bring in exceptional kids into their programs. And so that's an example that could be here. And then the government gets a three because they see that, hey, we still implemented this system well. They're still bringing in kids. That's good enough for us. So this is just the first round. So, like I said before, if we go infinite rounds, eventually we're going to see the redistribution of funding from the government based off of the results from each level of school. So, as we know, if the high level school keeps producing talent and keeps bringing in these exceptional kids, they're going to get more funding because the government knows that their system's going to be good. The government's going to look good. School's going to look good. Parents, everybody's going to look good. Mid-level school is going to get still an increase in funding, but not as much as high level, but they're still going to get an increase, so it could still redistribute unevenly. Where the low level school, like I said, they still bring in exceptional kids every now and then, but they're going to have less of a chance to do that if each round it continues to shift towards um, the mid level and high level sides compared to the low level sides, right? Because it's free. Most kids know that, it's their last resort, maybe, or maybe it's their only resort. And that's, something that we have to take into the account there. So this is the model, and that's the example that I gave. Hopefully, it could be very complicated if I added more variables and everything. So I wanted to just keep it simple there. And yeah, it shows clear trade-offs. It's the visual concept of the game model that we have. And if we look at the backwards induction, we know that the parents are going to want to choose the five first. If they can't do it, they're going to go to the three, and then if they can't do that, they're going to go to the two. And so if they have the ability to do five and the ability to do three, they're going to keep doing that every year. And that's going to eventually cut off two or give less opportunities to two, eventually less opportunities to three, maybe if they have the income that can go to five. So we see that and how that affects to the top of the resources and how they can get allocated. And so what if, so this is just really a short kind of questioning of the model. So if schools change their admissions, let's say the high level school goes from 10,000 to 7,000, but offers financial aid to parents, how does that change the model? Does that shift the redistribution of allocations from the government because they know that it's cheaper, so maybe more parents are going to go there? Does that mean that the government can give more money to the low level school so that we can create a more stable equilibrium, even though it's still unequal, like we discussed? And then, yeah, just how can the government change its funding to make sure that, the inequality is less, and is that a feasible thing to think about? And so that kind of goes with the policies and the things that could kind of help that become more equal. And then overall impact, like I said last week, choices by all players drive educational outcomes. Inequality does occur even though everybody's acting rationally. And the backwards induction, as we saw from the parents' choices, affect long-term patterns in infinite rounds, even though it may not look like it in the first round. And then this helps us look at how we can identify policies, funding reforms, things along those lines, so that way it can become an equilibrium for the low-level schools, the middle-level schools, and the high-level schools, where inequality is decreasing in all facets. So that's the implementation of our game model, the visual effect. And now I'll pass it over to Ava with the feasibility planning and preliminary plan.
So now we have our preliminary plan and all of the data to support the feasibility of our game theoretic approach. So first up, we have data on public opinion. So what options are parents considering? So this chart shows us what kinds of schools parents are considering in their decision-making process. So we can see that fewer parents are considering public traditional schools in their neighborhood, while options like homeschooling, online school, microschooling, charter schools, private schools, and hybrid learning have seen a huge increase in interest. So microschooling alone grew by 220%, which tells us that families are really starting to explore non-traditional models of schooling. So this data shows that even though what you might want for your child, you might not get that for your child, because some families might not even know where to start, which is shown here in our enrollment data. This shows a major disconnection between what parents want and where their kids actually go to school. Over 70% of current school parents said that they would choose a school other than their local public school district if they had the option. But if you took a look at actual enrollment data, over 80 students are still in their assigned public school. So that means a lot of parents are either unable to access a preferred option, or they find the school system too complicated to navigate. So this gap is crucial because it highlights one of the central challenges in education policy. People want choice, but the system doesn't always support it in practice. That leads us to funding information. So this chart shows nationwide how much money is publicly spent on public K through 12 students per pupil per year. This graph shows that we're more interested in investing more in public education now more than ever. We're now spending $16,000 per student annually, and that's a $2,000 increase over the past decade. So if we're spending more money on schooling, why aren't families more satisfied? Why is there still so much confusing and a lack of access of school choice for parents across America? So the truth is, funding alone isn't enough if families don't have the tools to make informed choices, which leads us to our policy recommendation. If we create a centralized state-run platforms to help parents understand their full range of school options, including public, charter, magnet, private, online, and guide them through these application and transfer processes, we will see a lot more school choice. So think of it as like a college application portal, but for K through 12 students. So something that's easy to navigate, transparent, and inclusive. So this would reduce confusion, save families time, and help ensure every child has an access to a school that fits their needs. This is especially important for low-income and first-generation families who may not have had the same access to information or support for school choice. And that leads us to our conclusion. So parents are clearly asking for more choices and better access, and yet the data shows that actual enrollment still heavily favors traditional public schools. So even though spending is rising, families remain stuck in a system that's hard to navigate and full of barriers. That's why creating a centralized, user-friendly platform is a smart and low-cost way to bridge this gap. It doesn't require much, it's just giving families tools with options that already exist. Thank you.